Why did she smile, standing there with blood on her lips, bound to a fence in the middle of nowhere? Most people would have broken already. Fear would have shown in their eyes, or at least desperation. But not Sarah. She stood against the wooden post, wrists cut raw from zip ties, her auburn hair tangled in the Montana wind, and a thin crimson line dripping from the corner of her mouth. The rumble of motorcycles circled like wolves around prey, the chrome catching the last orange of the dying sun. 5 bikes, 10 men, and at the center of it all a figure she knew from whispered stories in her husband's past. Maxwell Wolf, once a Delta Force operator, now something else entirely, an outlaw biker leader, drunk on power and menace. He cut the engine of his, swung off with the swagger of a man who believed the world owed him something. In his hand, a hunting knife caught the fading light. "Your husband thinks he's who exactly?" "John Wick," Wolf sneered, pressing the cold steel against her cheek. His breath reeked of whiskey. His men laughed, a chorus of hyenas circling their prize. Sarah should have been terrified. Instead, her lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. Her voice was steady, even defiant, as she looked him dead in the eye. "No, he's far more dangerous than that." The bikers stilled for a heartbeat. Then from the tree line, in a voice deep, calm, and terrifying in its certainty, came the words that shifted the air itself. "My wife is right about that." That was Jim, her husband, the man they thought was just a Montana rancher, the man they never should have crossed. But to understand how this quiet farmer became the nightmare stalking their circle that night, you have to go back. Back to a younger Jim, crawling on his belly through desert sand that burned like fire. Iraq, January 1991, Desert Storm. At just 21, Jim had already carried more weight than most men twice his age. The sand stung his eyes as he peered through night vision goggles. Ahead, an Iraqi bunker squatted like a shadow. Behind him, 3 rangers followed in silence, waiting for his hand signals. In his ear, the radio crackled. "Sandman, this is Overlord. Enemy reinforcements inbound. Extract Miller now or abort. Over." Jim's voice was calm, almost detached. "Overlord, this is Sandman. Negative on abort. We're getting our boy back." Captain Frank Miller had been missing for 18 hours. The brass said extraction was too risky. Jim said leaving a man behind wasn't an option. It never would be. The plan was simple, the execution wasn't. A diversionary blast to the north, breach from the east, in and out before dawn. 45 minutes later, as the sun bled into the desert sky, Jim staggered beneath the weight of Captain Miller, carrying him on his shoulders toward the waiting helicopter. Miller's legs were broken, his ribs shattered, his body nearly beaten into silence, but he was alive. As the bird lifted off, Miller's hand clutched Jim's arm. His voice was ragged, broken, but filled with truth. "I owe you my life." Jim just nodded, "Doing my job, sir." That moment never left him, not the sand, not the pain, not the weight of another man's life pressing into his shoulders. Never leave anyone behind, always prepare for the worst, and above all, remain calm under pressure. Decades later, in the quiet expanse of Clearwater Valley, Montana, Jim carried those lessons in silence. At 55, he looked every bit the rancher, tall, broad-shouldered, weathered from work under the sun. His dark hair was now salt and pepper, his hands calloused from turning wrenches on machines older than some of his neighbors. But in his eyes, if you looked close enough, you could still see it. The gaze of a man who had stared through the night scope, who had measured life and death in heartbeats. That afternoon, he bent over the stubborn bolts of his John tractor, cursing under his breath when the wrench slipped. The old radio hissed and crackled in the corner, cutting through the quiet with local news. Authorities in Idaho and western Montana report increased activity from the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, classified by federal authorities as an outlaw gang involved in weapons trafficking and drug distribution. Jim's hands froze on the wrench, his jaw tightened. For weeks he'd been following their movement, the Iron Wolves. It wasn't just their name that made his blood run cold, it was their leader. Wolf, the man who once fought beside him. The man Jim had been forced to testify against. The man who'd walked out of military prison after 7 years with nothing left to lose. Jim straightened and stretched, eyes drifting across the valley. 200 acres of their hard-won paradise stretched out in the spring light. 50 acres of hay. 30 of Sarah's vegetables. 40 of grazing cattle. Forest beyond that climbing into the hills. And their farmhouse, painted white against the green, standing like a promise they had built together. This land was their sanctuary, their healing place. But with the iron wolves moving east, with Wolf's shadow crawling closer every day, Jim wondered if that sanctuary was becoming a target. Boots crunched on gravel behind him. "Thought you might need some fuel," Sarah said, her auburn hair catching the light as she handed him a steaming mug of coffee. Even at 38, she carried a quiet strength that turned heads, though she never sought it. A D in agricultural biology, she had traded the bustle of Seattle's academic world for the soil of Montana, and in that soil she had rooted herself with him. Her green eyes caught everything, even the fleeting distraction in her husband's face. "You heard the news about those bikers?" she asked. "Just noise on the radio." Her brow furrowed. She knew him too well. That look, it's the same one you had before the wildfires last summer, the one that says you're already making plans. Jim tried to smile. Old habits. Old instincts, she corrected softly. And she was right, she always was. What he didn't tell her, what he hadn't told anyone, was that the man leading the Iron Wolves wasn't just some outlaw. It was Maxwell Wolf, a man who had once been his brother in arms, a man whose war crimes Jim himself had dragged into the light. That night, long after Sarah had gone to bed, Jim stood in the shadows of their old horse stable. He slid the heavy door shut, moved a feed rack, and revealed the keypad hidden behind it. Fingers entered a code. A wall opened. Stairs descended into the earth. And there it was, the life he had buried. The bunker, concrete walls. Shelves of weapons, cleaned and oiled with ritual precision. An arsenal most units would envy. And in a steel lockbox the ghosts of his past, medals, photographs, IDs, fragments of a life he thought he'd left behind. He opened a photo. Afghanistan 2001. 6 men dirt-streaked standing before a helicopter. His finger traced the faces: Martinez, dead in 2004. Williams, now in Dubai, practicing medicine in Missoula, himself impossibly young. And Wolf, Maxwell, before he became what he is now, before Syria, before bloodlust. Jim closed the box, locked it, and stared at the monitors feeding images of his land. Cameras, sensors, quiet guardians humming in the night. Behind him, soft footsteps. Sarah. "I thought I'd find you here," she said gently. He tried to shield her from it, from all of it. But Sarah had lived through too much beside him to be kept in the dark. She had seen him wake in cold sweats, seen him sit silent, haunted by things he never spoke aloud. She knew what this place meant. She knew what his silence meant. "You're worried," she whispered. Jim nodded. "Wolf is here, and he's not just passing through." Her eyes widened slightly. She remembered the name, the stories, the one he had against, the one who had taken the stand beside monsters. "Then we prepare," she said simply, without fear, without flinching. That was Sarah, always Sarah, the one who steadied him when nightmares clawed, the one who could look danger in the eye and not blink. Jim turned back to the monitors. Somewhere in the valley, somewhere in the silence, engines idled and men like shadows watched. Wolf was moving, and this time he wasn't just coming for land. He was coming for them. Why hadn't she told him what she overheard in town? Sarah turned the question over in her mind as she steered the old blue Ford down quiet Main Street. Maybe it was because she didn't want to burden him. Or maybe, deep down, she feared what the truth would unleash in him. The bell above Miller's General Store jingled as she walked inside. The smell was familiar: coffee, leather, wood smoke, comforting. but the voices she overheard weren't. "At least 15 of them at the Pine Tree Motel," whispered Mrs., the retired school teacher, her voice taut with unease. "Sheriff Davis drove by 3 times yesterday. Ernest says they were flashing $100 bills at the watering hole," Wilson replied. "Asking about land for sale, asking about the—" Sarah's hands froze on a can of WD-40. She forced herself to appear casual, forced herself to keep breathing. If they were asking about her and Jim, then the storm was closer than either of them had admitted. When she stepped back into the sunlight, the sheriff himself was waiting. Roger Davis, 63, former Marine, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He took off his hat, scratched his crew cut, and asked the question she had been dreading. "Everything all right out at your place, Sarah?" Her instinct was to deflect, smile, pretend, but something in his eyes stopped her. Eyes that had seen the same kinds of things Jim's had. "They mentioned us?" she asked quietly. Davis nodded. "Collins told them about your farm. Seems he's been showing them land. Mentioned the strategic location of your property." Strategic, that word again. Sarah felt the chill, even in the warm Montana morning. "Sheriff," she whispered, "you need to know if they're here for us, it isn't just business. It's personal." Davis studied her, measuring her words. He didn't push, didn't pry, just gave her the quiet respect of a man who recognized truth when he heard it. "If you need anything," he said, "day or night you call." But as she drove back toward the farm, a black pickup appeared in her mirror. It kept its distance. Every turn she took, it followed. She gripped the steering wheel, pulse quickening. By the time she turned onto their gravel driveway, it finally passed, heading down the road. She caught a glimpse of 2 men in leather vests. She didn't need to see the patches. She already knew. They knew where she lived. Jim was teaching Jacob Wilson to rebuild a carburetor when she returned. The boy listened intently, eager for every scrap of knowledge Jim shared. He reminded Jim of himself at that age, earnest, hungry, still whole. But the sound came again. That low, distant rumble, motorcycles. Jacob froze. Jim's posture shifted instantly, subtly, but Sarah knew the difference. Farmer 1 second, operator the next. "Jacob," Jim said quietly, "go inside. Find Sarah. Don't come out until I say." The boy didn't argue. He vanished toward the house. 5 motorcycles rolled into the driveway, dust swirling around them. A black pickup trailed behind, and then he saw him. Wolf. It had been 20 years. Prison had carved deeper lines into his face. The beard was streaked with silver, but those eyes, those predatory eyes, hadn't changed. "Afternoon," Wolf called out, stepping off his with a smile that carried no warmth. "Looking for the owner of this property." "You found him," Jim replied evenly. "Name?" Wolf's gaze swept the land. "Beautiful piece of ground you've got here, 200 acres, prime location, strategic even." Jim kept his face impassive. "We're not looking to sell." Wolf's smile widened. He gestured to the pickup. One of his men brought forward a briefcase. He popped it open. Stacks of $100 bills. "2 million cash," Wolf said. "No paperwork, no questions. You and the missus could start over anywhere you want." The temptation wasn't real. Not to Jim. He stared at the money as if it were worthless paper. "I said we're not selling." "Maybe you should ask your wife first," Wolf replied smoothly, voice dripping with condescension. "Women tend to see the practical side." Sarah's voice cut across the space before Jim could answer. "My husband already gave you our answer." She stood on the porch, arms crossed, gaze sharp and unwavering. Wolf's eyes lingered on her far too long, far too boldly. "Mrs.," he said with a smirk, 2 million reasons to reconsider." "Not interested," Sarah replied, her voice like steel. Wolf's smirk hardened. He snapped the briefcase shut. His tone shifted, friendly mask falling away. "People's situations change," he said softly. "Farming, a dangerous life. Equipment fails. Animals get sick. Sometimes even people get sick. Things get complicated fast. The threat hung heavy in the air. Jim stepped forward, his voice colder now. "We're done here." For a moment, Wolf's eyes narrowed, searching, studying Jim's face as though reaching for a memory. Then he gave a small, humorless laugh. "Funny thing about the past," he said, mounting his bike. "It has a way of catching up." Engines roared, dust filled the air. The convoy rolled away, leaving silence in their wake. Sarah stepped down from the porch, her voice low but certain. "That was him, wasn't it?" Jim nodded grimly. "Wolf. And he recognized you." "Not yet, but he will." That night they sat at the kitchen table, the yellow walls warm against the heavy silence. Jim finally told her everything. No redactions, no protective omissions, about Syria, about Wolf, about the villagers, about the trial. Her hand trembled only once, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Then this isn't just about land, it's about vengeance." Jim nodded, "And leverage." He walked her through the surveillance feeds, the arsenal, the maps of their property. Sarah didn't flinch. She processed, asked the right questions, used the right words. "What's our exposure?" she asked. "Limited for now." "And defenses?" "Sufficient." She opened a locked cabinet, pulled out her 19, and checked the magazine with practiced ease. "Then I start carrying again." Jim almost smiled. He had trained her himself. She kept her skills sharp. She wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was his partner in life and now in defense. But that night when she slept beside him, Jim lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He knew what was coming. Wolf wasn't here for business. Wolf was here for blood. The following morning, the valley seemed almost too calm. Sunlight painting the fields gold, birds darting between fence posts, the kind of peace that felt fragile. Jim's satellite phone buzzed, a secure line known by only a handful of men. He answered. "Jim, you magnificent bastard," came the reply, the voice of an old friend. "Michael Dock, former Delta medic, now an ER doctor in Missoula." "Wolf's back," Jim said flatly. There was a pause, then Doc's voice hardened. "Assessment. 7 confirmed on site, 30 plus in the region. Weapons, vehicles trying to buy me out. Leader is Wolf, recognized me partially. Escalation within 72 hours. Assets. Property secured, arsenal intact. Sarah trained but civilian, local sheriffs good but understaffed, county stretched thin. Need. Eyes, ears, hands. I'll be there by nightfall," Doc said, "and I'll bring supplies." When the call ended, Jim stood on the porch, steaming mug in hand, watching the land with new eyes. Every open stretch of pasture was a liability, every tree line a possible approach. The place they had built as sanctuary had just become a battlefield. Inside, Sarah was already working, researching, gathering intelligence. She had pulled old maps, combed archives, even unearthed a Prohibition-era document suggesting tunnels ran beneath their land toward the Canadian border. Smuggling tunnels, long forgotten. It made sense now. Wolf didn't just want their farm, he wanted access, routes, channels no law enforcement could see. When she laid the faded paper on the table, Jim leaned over it slowly. His finger traced the hand-drawn lines. A tunnel, a secret corridor, 6 miles, maybe more. "If he knows about this," Jim said, "then our land isn't just valuable, it's priceless." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "Then we find the entrance before he does." As afternoon shadows stretched across the valley, the rumble of another vehicle echoed up the gravel drive. Jim's hand went instinctively to his sidearm. It was Wolf, not yet. It was Sheriff Davis, stepping out of his patrol SUV with that slow, measured stride. He removed his hat, looked Jim straight in the eye, and said words that froze time. "Back in Kuwait, 91, we got pinned near the Bergen oil fields. Special ops team pulled us out. The lieutenant leading that mission, call sign Sandman. His gaze didn't waver. That was you, wasn't it? Silence stretched between them. Finally, Jim said, that was a long time ago. Davis nodded once. Doesn't matter, point is, I know who you are now, and whatever happens, you won't face it alone. Sarah watched as her husband gave the smallest nod. She had seen him carry men out of deserts. She had seen him break under nightmares. But now, for the first time since Wolf's return, she saw something else flicker in his eyes. Resolve. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was defense of their land, their life, their dignity. And when Wolf came, he would find more than a farmer and his wife. He would find the storm waiting for him. What did it mean when your enemy already knew your name, your land, your history? That question weighed on Sarah as she moved through the farmhouse that night, double-checking locks, her holstered at her hip. She had always known Jim carried shadows from his service. What she hadn't realized, until now, was how those shadows might walk through her front door one day. Down in the bunker, the glow of monitors painted Jim's face in cold light. 6 screens showed their property: driveway, barn, cattle pasture, forest line, each one quiet, each one deceptive. Sarah came down the stairs, her auburn hair pulled back, her jaw set. She'd been thinking all day, connecting dots, analyzing details the way she used to in the lab. But this wasn't research anymore. This was survival. Wolf doesn't just want the farm, she said softly, standing beside Jim. He wants the tunnel, the Canadian route, its history repeating itself. Bootleggers once used it. Now he wants it for something worse. Jim didn't deny it, he just nodded. You think he knows the entrance is on our land? He wouldn't be here if he didn't, Jim replied. Sarah placed her palm on the map. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Then it isn't just about us anymore. If he gets that tunnel, he poisons more than just this valley. Jim studied her, remembering the woman he met years ago, before the deployments, before the scars. A scientist who believed in solving problems with thought, not force. Yet here she stood, her hand steady on a map of war. He touched her wrist gently. I'll protect you. She turned to him, eyes flashing. We protect each other. It was an argument as old as their marriage. He tried to shield her. She refused to be sheltered. In that tension, they found balance. By the time dawn broke, the plan was already moving. Jim contacted Doc, who was on the road with supplies. He reached out to another old teammate, Carlos Ghost Mendoza, demolitions expert turned mechanic in Bozeman. Ghost's voice over the secure line was sharp, alive with the kind of energy Jim hadn't heard in years. The gang's back together, Ghost said, minus the part where we get shot at, hopefully. No guarantees, Jim replied. When Doc arrived, the years seemed to vanish. He was broader now, hair peppered gray, but his eyes hadn't changed. Eyes that had measured bleeding wounds, that had stitched life back into broken bodies in the worst places on Earth. He hugged Sarah warmly, then clasped Jim's hand in silence. You look like hell, Doc muttered. You came anyway. Delta doesn't retire, brother. We just reposition. Sarah watched the reunion quietly, her heart twisting. These men had history she could never fully know, stitched together in firefights and shadows. Yet she was part of it now, not by choice but by necessity. Hours later, Ghost rolled up in a beat-up van. Lean, wiry, his grin flashing even in the tense air. He clapped Jim on the shoulder. Thought you'd gone soft, Iron Jim. Turns out, you've just been hiding in Montana with a beautiful wife and a secret arsenal. Jim didn't smile. Wolf found me, he won't stop. Ghost's grin faded. Then we don't let him. By evening, the farmhouse felt less like a home and more like a command post. Maps spread across the table. Weapons laid out, magazines checked, reload drills practiced. Sarah changed out of her flannel into tactical clothing that mirrored theirs. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Doc watched her handle, though with smooth precision. He nodded in approval. You trained her well. She trained herself, Jim corrected quietly. For Sarah, it wasn't about proving anything. It was about refusing to be anyone's leverage. She had seen what Wolf's eyes meant when they lingered too long. He thought she was a weakness. He thought he could use her to break Jim. She intended to prove him wrong. That night the security system triggered. Motion sensors at the north pasture. Jim leaned over the monitor, muscles tightening. 3 figures moved through the dark, releasing something from a cage. Coyotes. The predators darted into the cattle herd, spooking the animals into chaos. The bikers stood at the fence, watching with cruel satisfaction. "They're testing us," Doc muttered. "Or sending a message," Ghost added. Sarah's face hardened as she reached for her tranquilizer rifle. "They want to use animals as weapons. Then I'll deal with it." Through the night vision scope she tracked the panicked movement of the coyotes. Her breaths were steady, hands controlled. One shot, then another. Within minutes the animals slumped harmlessly to the grass, sedated. "Clear," she whispered into comms. Ghost whistled low. "Remind me never to get on her bad side." But Sarah didn't smile. She stroked the rifle barrel softly, her heart aching. Coyotes were just wild creatures caught in someone else's war, used like pawns. How different was that from the young soldiers she had read about in history. Boys sent to die in deserts and jungles by men in suits, never knowing the reasons why. By the time dawn broke, the herd was calm again, but the message remained. Wolf could touch their world without crossing their fence. The next escalation was worse. It came with the morning sun. 5 of their cattle, prized, lay slaughtered at the northern perimeter, necks cut with surgical precision, sensors disabled. Sarah covered her mouth, staring at the dark blood soaking into the grass. Jim knelt beside one of the animals, jaw set tight. He didn't speak for a long moment. Finally, he whispered, "They're showing us they can cut deep, economically, psychologically, strategically." Doc stood nearby, his voice low. "Professional work, 1 cut each. Wolf's got ex-military working for him." Sarah's stomach churned. She thought of Jacob Wilson, of Ruth, of the townspeople who still didn't fully understand the storm coming. If Wolf could do this, what would he do to them? That night the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table, the air thick with exhaustion and fury. Jim laid out their options. 1. Report to federal authorities, build evidence, wait for them to act, but they won't be here in time. 2. Ghost interjected, we go on offense, hit them before they hit us. 3. Doc countered, we hold our ground, defend by time. Sarah listened quietly, sipping coffee that had gone cold. When Jim's eyes met hers, she finally spoke. What's the mission? She asked. They all looked at her. You're soldiers, you always had missions, clear objectives. What's the mission here? Survive, protect the farm, protect the town. Her voice grew firmer. Or stop Wolf from poisoning everything beyond these hills. The silence that followed was heavier than gunmetal. Jim finally spoke. The mission is all of it, survive, protect, stop him. Sarah nodded. Her heart ached with fear, but beneath it was something else. Hope, determination, the same qualities that had carried her through Jim's deployments, through his nightmares, through years of uncertainty. If Wolf thought she was just a farmer's wife, he had no idea what he was walking into. That evening, headlights cut down the gravel drive. One bike, not a convoy, not an attack. A messenger. Michael, a man Sarah recognized from town, approached with an envelope. His voice was flat. Wolf says accidents tend to escalate. Today it was cattle. Tomorrow could be houses, could be people. Final offer in here. 3 million cash, 24 hours to decide. He handed Jim the envelope. Then he added, voice lower, eyes colder, Wolf remembers Syria now. Said to ask if you remember the village. Sarah's heart lurched. When left, Jim opened the envelope. Photos spilled onto the table. Surveillance shots of their property, thermal imaging, pictures of Sarah at the store. Pictures of Jacob, pictures of Doc arriving. A handwritten note. I see everything. You have until noon tomorrow. After that, I take what's mine. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up one of the photos, her face staring back at her, unaware, vulnerable. She felt exposed in a way she never had before. Jim's hand closed over hers. His voice was steady, but his eyes were storm-dark. He thinks he can break us with fear, Jim said quietly, but he's forgotten one thing. Sarah looked up at him, waiting. We don't break. Why did the church feel colder than the Montana wind outside? Sarah sat in the fellowship hall, Doc beside her, while nearly the entire town filled the wooden chairs. Farmers, shop owners, teenagers leaning against the back wall, all of them pulled into the storm that Wolf had carried into the valley. Sheriff Davis stood at the front, his silver crew cut catching the light. His voice carried the authority of a man who had led Marines through fire. Folks, the Iron Wolves are no ordinary visitors. We've seen intimidation, property damage, and criminal behavior. But until they cross a line, our hands are tied. My office will enforce the law, but we're outnumbered. You all know that. The room stirred with anxious whispers. Sarah felt the weight of their eyes turning toward her. She hadn't wanted this. Hadn't wanted to be the center of suspicion or fear. But when Frank Miller, the store owner, rose to his feet, the whispers sharpened into words. They're classified as a criminal organization. My supplier in Missoula says they're tied to trafficking. This isn't tourism. This is occupation. Collins, the neighbor who had tried to sell them his land, stood up next. His voice was oily, practiced. Rumors, Frank. The wolves are spending money here. And let's not forget, this started because they refused a generous offer. Maybe we wouldn't be in danger if they'd been willing to sell. Sarah's pulse spiked. She wanted to shout, to tell him he had no idea what kind of man Wolf was. But before she could stand, Wilson, Jacob's grandmother, beat her to it. They are good people, said firmly. They came here to build a life. They've given Jacob guidance, they've helped neighbors. If they don't want to sell, that's their right. That right is putting all of us at risk, Collins shot back. Last night there was trouble out at their farm, military-style trouble. What exactly is background anyway? Who are they really? The air tightened. Sarah stood slowly, every pair of eyes locking onto her. Her voice, when it came, wasn't defensive. It was steady, measured, like she had rehearsed it 100 times in her head. My husband served this country, she said. Like many veterans, he doesn't talk much about it. We came here for peace, not conflict. We bought our farm legally. We invested in this community. And until now, we've never brought trouble to anyone's doorstep. But the wolves, they've killed our livestock. They've threatened us. They've tried to burn our home while we slept. If defending ourselves makes us a problem for this town, then I apologize. But ask yourselves, would you lie down if it were your family? Your land. Silence. Then from the back, a voice like gravel breaking. Edward Harmon, 73, Vietnam veteran. He leaned on his cane as he rose. I've listened enough, he said. Some of you weren't here in '87 when the Sons of Silence tried to set up shop in this valley. They came with money, promises, and threats, just like these wolves, and we drove them out. Not because the sheriff had enough deputies, but because we stood together. His eyes found Sarah's. They shouldn't stand alone either. A murmur swept the room. Some nodded. Some looked away. Division had roots here, but so did loyalty. After the meeting, Harmon approached Sarah privately. His hands shook as he pressed a folded note into hers. 7 of us, he whispered, too old for direct fighting, but we know these hills. We've got radios, eyes, ears, call us watchdog. Frequencies are in there, you won't be alone. Sarah felt tears threaten her eyes but held them back. She nodded, squeezing his hand. On the drive home, she kept replaying the meeting in her head. How Collins had blamed them. How Harmon had offered support. How neighbors looked at her with a mix of suspicion and sympathy. Doc drove, his eyes flicked to the mirror. We've got a tail, he murmured. A black SUV followed them, headlights too steady, distance too precise. They drove past the property line where Ghost waited hidden in the trees. At the signal, Ghost stepped out, not with a weapon but with a camera. The flash of his lens lit up the SUV's windshield, documenting, catching plates. The SUV reversed immediately, retreating into the night. When they pulled into the driveway, Jim was waiting, rifle slung across his chest. Sarah climbed out of the truck, her heart still pounding. "They're probing us," Doc reported, "testing reactions." "And gathering intelligence," Sarah added. "Using locals, paying them, manipulating them." Jim's jaw tightened. "Then no one outside this house is trustworthy, not fully, not until this ends." Later that night, while Ghost and Doc checked equipment, Jim unrolled maps on the kitchen table. The plan was taking shape. "Operation Firebreak," he said, tracing lines with his finger. "We disrupt them before they hit us. Not a full assault, just confusion, delay, non-lethal tactics only." Sarah listened, arms folded. She wanted to object, wanted to beg him not to put himself in more danger than necessary. But she saw his eyes, the same eyes that had once carried Captain Miller out of the desert. When Jim had that look, there was no stopping him. Ghost grinned as he packed charges into his bag. "It'll be like old times." Doc shook his head. "Old times almost killed us." Sarah touched Jim's arm. Her voice was low. "Just come back." He leaned close, kissed her forehead and whispered, "Always." They moved through the forest like shadows, two men who had done this 1,000 times. Ghost carried the disruptors. Jim carried the strobe devices, smoke and comms. At the Pine Tree Motel, they counted 34 wolves, motorcycles, vans, equipment crates, Wolf himself barking orders outside the command building. "Vehicles first," Jim whispered. Ghost grinned, planting disruptors that would fry ignition systems. Jim cut power at the utility box, plunging the motel into darkness. Panic rippled through the compound. Wolf stormed outside, shouting, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Ghost slipped into the office, disabling radios. Jim released smoke dispensers, covering their withdrawal. They melted into the tree line, silent as ghosts themselves. "Estimated 4 hours before they recover," Ghost whispered. "Plenty of time," Jim replied. Back at the farm, Sarah was waiting. She ran to him the moment he emerged from the shadows, her hands trembling as they touched his chest, his face, as if to confirm he was real. He caught her hands in his, holding them tight. "It worked," he said softly. But even as he spoke, a new voice crackled over comms. Harmon's. "Sandman, this is Watchdog. We saw your work. Impressive. But intel says Wolf isn't marching on your farm yet. He's splitting forces, sending a small team into town." Sarah stiffened. "What's the target?" Jim demanded. A pause, then Harmon's voice again grim. "They think Sarah's in town. They're moving to intercept her, likely objective capture." Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked at Jim, at Doc, at Ghost. They all knew what that meant. She wasn't just a target, she was leverage. And maybe, just maybe, an opportunity. "They think I'm in town," Sarah said slowly, "so let's give them what they expect." Jim's eyes burned with instant refusal. "No." She held his gaze. "Not as prey, as bait, on our terms, with overwatch, with traps controlled." The room went silent. Ghost leaned back, lips curling into a dangerous grin. "I like her plan." Doc sighed heavily. "She's not wrong. If we control the engagement, we weaken them before the real fight." Jim clenched his fists. His voice was raw, stripped of all command. "You are not expendable, not ever." Sarah stepped closer, pressing her hand to his chest. "I'm not expendable, I'm your strength, and it's time we use that." The room seemed to shrink around them. The farmhouse, the maps, the weapons, all of it faded until only their eyes remained locked. Finally Jim exhaled, long, reluctant. "Then we plan it down to the breath." And with that, Sarah's role shifted forever. No longer just the wife of a soldier, no longer just the scientist turned farmer. She was stepping into the line of fire by choice. For herself, for him, for the valley. The bait was set. Why did her hands feel steady, even as her heart pounded like a drum? Sarah asked herself that question as she stood in the mirror, pulling her auburn hair into a tight braid. She wore jeans, a dark jacket, and a small earpiece tucked beneath her hair. Nothing that screamed combat. Nothing that drew attention. Just another woman in town on errands. Except this wasn't an errand. This was bait. Downstairs, Jim paced the kitchen like a caged animal. Ghost cleaned a suppressed MP5 on the table. Doc adjusted medical gear, his hands calm but his jaw tight. Sheriff Davis sat with a radio, already patched into Harmon, and the watchdog volunteers stationed around town. "You're not going alone," Jim said for the 10th time. "I won't be," Sarah replied, checking her. "You'll all be there, just not beside me." The logic didn't soothe him. He wanted her within arm's reach, behind fences, behind walls. But he also knew she was right. Wolf's men wouldn't bite unless the bait looked real. She paused at the door, meeting his eyes. "Trust me." The words cut him. He did trust her, always had. That was the problem. He trusted her courage too much, knew she would stand tall even when she should run. Sarah climbed into the Ford and drove toward, the comms alive with quiet updates. "Watchdog 1 in position," Harmon's voice came. "2 ready," another elder echoed. "Eyes on Main Street," Davis added. Sarah pulled into town, parking by Miller's General Store. She carried a reusable bag, stepping onto the sidewalk like any normal day. To anyone watching, she was just a woman running errands. Inside the store, Wilson gave her a knowing nod. The older woman squeezed her hand briefly, whispering, "We've got your back." Sarah's throat tightened. These people, farmers, retirees, shopkeepers, were risking themselves for her, for Jim, for the valley. She picked up flour and coffee, letting minutes pass. Her eyes flicked to the reflection in the glass door. A black SUV parked across the street. 2 men leaned against it, pretending to smoke. Their leather vests bore the wolf insignia. Her earpiece crackled softly. "Eyes on," Ghost murmured. 2 at the SUV, 1 on the corner by the diner, another in the alley. Doc's voice followed. "4 total, not the full team, they're probing." Sarah's pulse raced, but she forced her movements to stay calm, casual. She paid, thanked her, and stepped back onto the street. The men's eyes tracked her instantly, predators recognizing prey. She crossed toward her truck. One of the bikers flicked his cigarette, stepped forward. "Hey there, sweetheart," he drawled. "Need help with those bags?" Sarah ignored him, unlocking the door. He moved closer, smile widening. "Pretty lady like you shouldn't be all alone out here." "2 more moving," Ghost whispered over comms. Sarah set the bags down, turned slowly, and locked eyes with the man. Her voice was calm, steady. "I'm not alone." The biker frowned, confused. And then the trap snapped shut. The streetlights above flickered as Ghost triggered the EMP disruptor hidden in the lamppost. Radios and phones died instantly. Sheriff Davis's cruiser rolled up from the side street, lights flashing, siren wailing. Watchdog volunteers emerged from alleys, rifles shouldered but not fired. "Sheriff's office," Davis barked. "Hands where I can see them." Chaos exploded. The biker nearest Sarah grabbed for her arm, but she was faster. Her was up, pressed to his chest before his hand even touched her. "Don't," she warned. Another reached for a weapon, but a warning shot cracked from Harmon's position across the street, shattering the pavement inches from his boot. The old man's voice carried like thunder. "Don't test us, son." For a heartbeat, the wolves hesitated, surrounded. Outnumbered in this one place, this one moment. Then tires screeched. Another SUV roared into the street, windows down, gun barrels flashing. "Cover," Doc shouted. Sarah dove behind her truck as rounds shattered glass around her. Watchdog volunteers fired back, controlled, precise. Davis dragged one wounded farmer to cover, barking orders with the calm of a Marine under fire. Ghost sprinted through the chaos, tossing a smoke canister that bloomed thick gray clouds across Main Street. Through the haze, Sarah saw movement, one of the bikers rushing toward her. She raised her, but before she could fire, Jim's rifle cracked from the rooftop. The biker dropped, his weapon skittering across the pavement. "Eyes on you," Jim's voice came through her comms. Calm, absolute. Adrenaline surged. Fear threatened to swallow her, but she shoved it down, focused on breath, sight, trigger discipline. She wasn't just bait anymore. She was fighting. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the gunfire ceased. Engines roared retreat. The wolves pulled back, dragging wounded with them. Smoke drifted. Glass lay scattered. Sheriff Davis lowered his rifle, scanning the street. Clear. Sarah stood slowly, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. She looked at the broken storefronts, the bullet holes, the shattered piece of their small town. Doc approached, checking her quickly for injuries. "You good?" She nodded, just shaken. Jim appeared moments later, boots pounding down the stairs from his overwatch position. He reached her, pulling her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. "Never again," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "Never." But Sarah pulled back, meeting his eyes. "Jim, listen to me. If we hadn't done this, if we hadn't drawn them out, they would have come for me anyway. At night, on the road, somewhere we couldn't control. This was the only way." He hated that she was right, hated it with every fiber of his being. Back at the farmhouse, the debrief was somber. Watchdog reported minor injuries, no fatalities, but they all knew the wolves would escalate. "They won't take the humiliation lightly," Doc warned. "Wolf will respond hard, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon." Sarah sat at the table, wrapping her hands around a mug of coffee gone cold. She stared at the steam, her voice quiet. "Today I felt what Jim must have felt all those years. That line between fear and focus. That weight of knowing one mistake ends it all. But I also felt something else." They all looked at her. "I felt power, not the kind that destroys, the kind that refuses to be broken. If Wolf wants to make me a pawn, then I'll be the pawn that turns into a queen." Ghost chuckled low. "Remind me again why she isn't leading this op." Jim didn't laugh. He just reached for her hand under the table, gripping it tightly. The next morning, Harmon's voice came over the radio, grim, heavy. "Sandman, watchdog, we picked up chatter. Wolf knows who you are now, not just farmer, he knows you're Sandman." The room fell silent. Sarah's breath caught. She knew what that meant. Wolf wasn't coming just for land, not just for leverage, not even just for vengeance. He was coming to finish the war Jim had started decades ago. Why did silence feel louder than gunfire? Sarah sat on the porch that evening, watching the valley stretch wide and deceptively calm. The cattle grazed. The wind moved through the pines. To a stranger, it was paradise. But to her, every rustle in the brush felt like a prelude. Every gust of wind felt like a warning. Inside, the men checked gear. Ghost fiddled with claymore triggers, Doc medical supplies. Jim paced like a man waiting for a storm he knew would come. Sheriff Davis had gone back into town to rally what few deputies he had left. The watchdog elders had taken positions in ridges overlooking the main roads. Sarah sipped from a mug of black coffee gone bitter. Her stomach churned with nerves, but her hand stayed steady. She made her choice days ago. She would not be prey. But the fear was still there, coiled inside her, whispering. What if they were too many? What if the tunnels gave Wolf more than just access? What if Jim's past finally swallowed them whole? Her comms clicked. Harmon's voice came through, strained. "Movement on the highway, dozens of bikes, 2 trucks, they're headed your way." Sarah's mug slipped from her hand, shattering on the porch. The sound made Jim appear instantly, rifle already in hand. "How many?" he asked into comms. 30 at least, Harmon replied. "Maybe more. They're not hiding anymore. They're coming in force." Sarah stood, heart pounding. This was it. Jim turned to her. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned. "Basement, now." "No," she shot back. "I stay with you." "Sarah, you said we protect each other. You don't get to lock me away." The room felt tense. Doc and Ghost exchanged quick glances but said nothing. Finally, Jim exhaled, the fight draining out of him. He handed her a comm unit, checked her, and nodded once. "Stay behind cover. Stay disciplined. And if I tell you to run—" "I won't," she interrupted. He almost smiled, grim and broken. "Of course you won't." Minutes later, engines thundered through the valley. Headlights cut through the dark. The wolves poured down the gravel road like a swarm of predators. Wolf himself rode at the front, his beard wild, his eyes locked on the farmhouse. The first shots weren't fired by Jim. They came from Harmon's ridge. A warning burst across the lead truck's windshield. The convoy screeched to a halt, chaos rippling. Jim gave the command calmly, "Fire break." Ghost triggered the first charges. Explosions lit the night, shredding tires, blocking the road with burning wreckage. Wolves scattered, shouting, scrambling. Sarah crouched behind the stone wall by the porch, her raised, every muscle taut. She watched as bikers spilled into the fields, some rushing toward the barn, others flanking through the tree line. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but she forced herself to wait. Patience. Jim's voice in her head. Always patience. Then she saw one, leather vest, rifle raised, sprinting toward the cattle pen. He aimed at the animals, at the heart of their livelihood. Her shot cracked through the night. He dropped. Her breath caught her first. She swallowed hard, bile rising in her throat, but there was no time to process. Another came. She fired again. Inside, Ghost let out a low laugh. "She's better than half the men I served with." Doc muttered, "Better composure too." Jim didn't answer. He was already moving, rifle sharp, every shot deliberate. He wasn't just defending. He was leading. Old instincts awake again. Sandman was back. The wolves regrouped fast. They weren't amateurs. Jim recognized military patterns in their advance, flanking, suppressing fire, coordinated pushes. Wolf had men who'd seen combat, maybe contractors, maybe deserters. Either way, this was no longer just a biker gang. Over comms, Harmon's voice came urgent. "They're probing your flanks hard, 10 pushing east, 6 on the ridge." "Copy," Jim replied. "Hold them, don't expose." "Already lost one," Harmon whispered. "'S down." Sarah closed her eyes for half a second. 70 years old, offered his eyes and ears for this fight, dead because of them, because Wolf wanted vengeance. Her chest tightened, but she shoved it down. She couldn't grieve yet, not now. The wolves' second wave came harder. Molotovs arced through the night, flames licking the barn walls. Sarah sprinted with a fire extinguisher, dousing sparks before they spread. Ghost covered her with bursts of automatic fire. Jim shouted orders, pulling Ghost back just as a bullet shattered the post beside him. Then the comms crackled with a voice that froze Sarah's blood. "Sandman," Wolf drawled, his tone almost casual. "Long time, you thought Syria was over, but I promised you I'd find you again." Jim's grip on his rifle tightened. His voice was ice. "You've got 30 seconds to retreat before I cut the rest of your men down." Wolf laughed. 30 seconds. Jim, I've waited 30 years. Tonight I take everything from you, the farm, the woman, the pride. You'll watch it burn, and then I'll finish what I started." Sarah's comm stayed open. She knew Wolf wanted her to hear, wanted her fear, but instead of fear, something else stirred inside her. Anger. She pressed her comm. Her voice was steady. "You won't touch my husband. You won't touch my land. You're nothing but a coward hiding behind boys you've broken." There was silence. Then Wolf's laugh again, darker now. Fiery. "I like that. I'll make sure to keep you alive just long enough for him to see." Jim's voice cut back in hard. "You won't get within 100 yards of her." Gunfire erupted again, cutting off the exchange. The wolves pushed through the tree line, but Jim and Ghost were ready. Claymores detonated, ripping through the advance. Screams pierced the night. Doc worked furiously inside, tending to Harmon's wounded man dragged in under fire. Sarah reloaded, hands trembling, but forced them steady again. For every man they dropped, two more seemed to appear. The siege stretched deep into the night. Hours blurred. Smoke, gunfire, shouts. Fear clawed at Sarah, but she held the line. She wasn't prey anymore. By dawn, the wolves had pulled back. Bodies lay scattered across the field. Fires smoldered. The farm stood, but barely. Sarah sank against the porch wall, exhaustion crashing over her. Her hands shook violently now, no matter how she tried to stop them. Jim knelt beside her, touching her face gently. "You did it," he whispered. Her eyes filled, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "We did it, but Jim, it's not over. He's not done." Jim nodded grimly, staring at the horizon where the wolves had vanished. Wolf had tasted blood now. He wouldn't retreat forever. Sarah's voice trembled. "How many more people die before it ends?" Jim pulled her close, his voice raw. "As few as I can save, that's all I know." The valley was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence between storms. And Sarah knew, deep in her bones, that the next storm would be worse. Why did the quiet of morning feel like a lie? Sarah stood at the kitchen window, staring at the field where bodies had been carried away only hours earlier. The dew glistened on the grass, but she couldn't stop seeing blood there, couldn't stop hearing the echo of screams. Jim was outside, already working. His shoulders moved with grim precision as he repaired fence lines, buried traps, repositioned cameras. He was relentless, a machine of preparation. But Sarah knew what that look meant. He wasn't just fixing the land. He was trying to fix the ghosts. She turned when Doc entered, his face drawn, his hands shaking slightly. "Harmon's men are breaking," he said. "They lost. Another's wounded bad. The rest are questioning if it's worth it." "Of course they are," Sarah whispered. "They didn't sign up for war." Doc sat heavily at the table, rubbing his temples. "Neither did you." Her lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "No, but here we are." Outside, Ghost appeared, carrying he tossed it onto the table. "Tapped a channel. Wolf's men are broadcasting, bragging, and there's something worse." Sarah froze. "What?" Ghost's grin faded. "They're not retreating, they're regrouping, and they've got reinforcements coming from Idaho, mercs, not bikers, hired guns." Jim walked in, overhearing, his jaw clenched. "How long?" "Day 2 at most." The air grew heavy. Sarah's heart sank. 30 bikers had nearly broken them. Reinforcements meant annihilation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah said quietly, "We can't just sit here waiting for them to crush us." Jim looked at her sharply. "What are you suggesting?" She met his gaze. "We take it to him, not as men, him, Wolf." The room went still. Ghost raised an eyebrow. Doc shook his head instantly. "Too dangerous." But Sarah pressed on. "This doesn't end with firefights. It ends with him. He's the head. Cut it off and the body falls apart." Jim's silence was louder than any protest. He knew she was right. He just couldn't stand hearing her say it. That night Sarah dreamed of fire. She saw the barn burning, the cattle screaming, the farmhouse collapsing. She saw Wolf's face, twisted in laughter, and she saw herself tied to a fence, screaming for Jim. She woke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, and when she looked out the window, her blood turned to ice. Headlights. 2 vehicles, creeping slow down the gravel road. She slipped from bed, pulling on her jacket, grabbing her. Jim stirred instantly, already awake, already reaching for his rifle. They moved to the porch, silent, shadows among shadows. Ghost was already outside, crouched low. Doc appeared with his med bag slung across his chest. The vehicle stopped 100 yards out. Doors opened. Figures stepped out, dragging something between them. Sarah's breath caught. It wasn't something, it was someone. Jacob. The boy. They shoved him forward into the headlights, his hands bound, a gag in his mouth. He stumbled, terrified, eyes wide with panic. Sarah's stomach lurched. "No," she whispered. A voice boomed through a loudspeaker, Wolf's voice. "Sandman, you cost me men, you cost me pride. Now you pay. 1 hour. You come out unarmed and give me what's mine, the land, the tunnel, or the boy dies." Sarah's heart pounded so loud she couldn't hear her own breath. Jim's face turned to stone. "Don't move," Ghost hissed. "It's a setup." But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes from Jacob. She saw his small frame trembling, the gag muffling his cries. He was just a kid who looked up to Jim like a father, a kid who had no part in this war. Her voice cracked. "Jim, we can't let them." "We won't," he cut in, harsh but steady. "But we do this smart. One wrong move and he's gone." Doc swore under his breath. "They'll kill him anyway, Jim, you know it." The loudspeaker blared again. "Tick-tock, Sandman, clock's running." Sarah gripped Jim's arm, her nails dug into his skin. "Then we go, tonight, we end this before he ends us." For a long, terrible moment, Jim didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Jacob, on the trembling boy who was now their hostage, their leverage. Finally, Jim's voice came low and raw. "We end it tonight." They gathered at the table, maps spread, radios buzzing. The plan was reckless, maybe suicidal, but it was the only chance left. Ghost outlined the approach. "Motel compounds reinforced now. They'll expect us from the front. We don't go front. We go through the tree line, hit their power, sow chaos. We extract the boy, we take Wolf." Doc shook his head. "Extraction's risky enough, but if you go after Wolf..." Jim cut him off. "No more half measures, he doesn't stop, ever, we end him." Sarah spoke quietly, but her words carried weight. "Then I'm going too." All three men stared at her. "No," Jim said instantly. "Yes," she countered. "I know the land, I know the science. You need my eyes, my brain, my steadiness. You can't ask me to hide when every choice now decides if we live." Doc tried to reason. "Sarah, this isn't your fight." Her eyes burned. "It is now. It always was the moment he set eyes on me. He wants to use me, break me, but I won't be his victim. Not tonight, not ever." Ghost let out a low whistle. "She's got more guts than the three of us combined." Jim closed his eyes, torn between fury and love, fear and respect. Finally, he whispered, "Stay close. No heroics, you move when I move." Sarah nodded. Her heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm. "Always." They set out near midnight. Ghost carried charges. Doc carried medical gear. Jim carried silence heavier than any weapon. And Sarah carried resolve, the kind forged not on battlefields but in years of holding a home together through absence, through trauma, through love that refused to break. The motel compound glowed faintly in the distance. Music thudded. Wolves drank, laughed, loaded weapons. Jacob was inside, and so was Wolf. Sarah crouched low in the tree line, watching through night vision. Her breath fogged in the cold. Her fingers brushed the cross Jim had given her years ago, back when he first came home broken. Her whisper barely carried, "We finish this." Jim's hand squeezed her shoulder once. Then the night exploded into motion. Ghost charges cut the power. Darkness swallowed the compound. Shouts rose, chaotic, panicked. Jim moved like a shadow, silent, precise. Doc covered angles, steady under fire. And Sarah followed, heart pounding, ready, every step a choice. Fear screamed at her to turn back, but resolve kept her forward. Inside they found Jacob tied to a chair, tears streaking his dirt-stained face. Doc cut his bonds while Jim covered the door. Sarah knelt, whispering, you're safe now." But even as the boy clung to her, a voice filled the room. Wolf's voice, calm, cold, too close. "You came for him, just like I knew you would." and Sarah realized too late that they hadn't walked into a rescue. They walked into a trap. Why did the dark feel thicker here? Sarah's breath hitched as the door swung open and shadows poured into the room. Wolf's men, rifles raised, eyes gleaming with triumph. Jacob whimpered against her side, and Sarah felt his small body tremble as though every vibration of the floor would shatter him. Jim's rifle was already up. Ghost shifted to cover the flank. Doc pulled Jacob behind him. For a moment the world hung still, like the air before a storm breaks. Then Wolf stepped through the doorway. His frame filled the threshold. His beard was streaked with gray now, his eyes ringed by sleepless nights and rage decades old. He smiled when he saw Jim, but it wasn't joy. It was venom. "Sandman," he drawled, "always where the blood is thickest." Jim said nothing. His silence was heavier than words, heavier than the rifle gripped in his hands. Wolf's gaze shifted, landing on Sarah. His smile widened. "And this must be the prize. The fire in her eyes says more than you ever could. Brave little thing, I almost pity her." Sarah lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Her voice was steady, even if her insides trembled. "You don't pity anyone, you use them. That's all you've ever done." Wolf laughed, deep and cruel. "She speaks. Careful, Sandman, this one has teeth. Maybe I'll break her slow, make her watch you beg first." Jim's eyes burned, but he didn't move. Didn't speak, not yet. The standoff stretched, unbearable. Then Wolf snapped his fingers. His men lunged forward. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the enclosed space. Ghost dropped two instantly. Jim fired controlled bursts, every round deliberate. Sarah pulled Jacob to the floor, shielding him with her own body as splinters exploded around them. Doc dragged them toward cover, cursing under his breath. Wolf didn't fire. He stood back, watching, savoring. Sarah's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to stay down, to keep Jacob safe. But something else pressed harder. A voice inside her, the one that had spoken at the town meeting, the one that had steadied her hand on the porch, rose above the fear. She looked at Jim. His eyes caught hers for a single second, and in that look she saw it, the weight of decades of promises, of ghosts. He couldn't carry it alone anymore. She shifted Jacob behind Doc, rose to her knees and fired. One shot clean into the chest of the man flanking Jim. He dropped. Jim didn't flinch. He simply pivoted, using the opening, cutting down another. Ghost shouted, "Clear right." Doc yelled, "Move." But Wolf was already retreating, slipping into the maze of the motel's back halls. Jim surged forward. "He's mine." Sarah's voice broke out before she could stop it. "Then I'm with you." The chase through the motel was chaos. Hallways stank of smoke and gun oil. Doors hung open, rooms trashed, bottles and weapons scattered. Jim moved like a predator, tracking every sound, every shadow. Sarah followed, her heart hammering, raised. Wolf's taunts echoed through the halls. "How many nights did you see me in your dreams, Sandman? How many bottles did it take to drown my laughter? And now I'll carve the rest of you away." Jim's face stayed carved in stone. But Sarah could feel it, the rage barely caged, the fury clawing at his composure. They turned a corner, a flash. A round tore through the wall inches from Sarah's head. She dropped, breath ragged. Jim dragged her to cover, eyes blazing. "You stay back," he snapped. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "No, I won't lose you to him. Not here, not like this." His eyes softened, only for a heartbeat. Then he nodded once. They pushed forward together. The final standoff came in the motel's gutted ballroom. Broken chandeliers dangled from the ceiling, dust and smoke swirling in the dim light. Wolf stood at the far end, shotgun in one hand, a machete in the other. He grinned when he saw them. "There's the couple, the happy ending. Let's see how much love survives when I split one of you open." Jim raised his rifle. Wolf fired first. The blast ripped into a pillar, spraying splinters. Jim answered with a burst that grazed Wolf's shoulder, spinning him back. But Wolf didn't fall. He laughed, the sound unhinged. Then he charged. Jim's rifle jammed. Wolf was on him in seconds, slamming him into the ground. The shotgun clattered away. The machete gleamed. Sarah screamed, raising her. But Wolf twisted, dragging Jim between them, using him as a shield. "Shoot, sweetheart," Wolf snarled. "Let's see if your love's steady enough." Her hands shook, her breath came fast. She saw Jim's eyes steady, calm, even now. They told her what he couldn't say aloud: do it, trust yourself. Wolf raised the blade. Sarah fired. The round tore through Wolf's shoulder. He roared, dropping the machete. Jim seized the opening, driving his fist into Wolf's face, rolling free. Wolf staggered, bleeding but still standing, still grinning through blood-stained teeth. "You think this ends me?" he spat. "I am the storm, I am." Sarah's second shot cut him off, clean, final. Wolf fell. Silence swallowed the room. For a long moment, Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Her hands trembled so violently she thought she'd dropped the gun. Then Jim was there, pulling it gently from her grip, wrapping her in his arms. "You did it," he whispered. "You saved us." Her tears finally broke, hot and unstoppable. "We saved each other." Dawn broke over the valley. Smoke rose from the motel ruins. Sheriff Davis's men swept through, rounding up the last stragglers. The wolves were broken, their leader dead. The threat that had haunted them for decades was finally gone. At the farmhouse, the watchdog elders gathered. Harmon's voice was hoarse but steady. "You stood when we couldn't. You carried what we no longer had the strength to carry. This valley owes you." Sarah shook her head. "We owe each other, that's how it works." She looked out at the land, the fields, the barn, the fences, but standing. Life would return here, slowly, painfully, but it would return. That night, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Sarah sat on the porch beside Jim. The silence felt different now. Not a warning, not a lie, a peace, hard one, fragile but real. She turned to him, her voice soft. "Do you ever wonder why we survive, Jim, when so many don't?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he answered, voice low. "Maybe it's not about survival. Maybe it's about standing. Just standing when everything else falls." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Not of fear this time, not of grief, but of something softer. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.